Okay, get ready to think about thinking. Because today, we're diving into metacognition.
It's not just a fancy word for thinking hard, though, is it?
Definitely not. This is about thinking about how we think. And from what I'm seeing in this philosophical deep dive you sent over, it gets to the core of, well, everything how we learn, make decisions, even who we are.
Absolutely. One of the most interesting things this source digs into is how understanding metacognition changes our whole understanding of knowledge
Oh,
itself.
like how?
Well, for instance, there's this whole discussion about what it means to truly accept something as true.
You mean like not just believing something, but
Yeah.
really taking it in as part of how you see the world?
Exactly. It's not just a gut feeling, right? It's about choosing to trust that feeling, even if you don't have all the reasons laid out. The text connects this to the differences between what it calls System 1 and System 2 thinking.
Ah, right, like that quick unconscious processing versus the slower, more analytical stuff.
Yeah, metacognition is like that bridge between them. And it gets even more interesting when you think about what we always focus on humans, but the text mentions monkeys, even spiders showing signs of metacognition.
Whoa, hold on, spiders.
Yeah.
What does that even mean, a spider thinking about its own thinking? Does that mean we've totally misunderstood how other minds work?
Right. We tend to link metacognition to things like language, really complex thought, but seeing a spider strategizing its hunt based on what it already understands about its environment, it kind of throws those assumptions out the window.
So maybe this isn't just about us. Maybe it's about how intelligence itself evolved. But bringing it back to humans for a second, where does all this leave our sense of free will? Like, if we're so busy thinking about thinking, are we really in control, or is it more complicated than that?
You've hit on the core issue there. The text really gets into how our minds might have this whole control system going on, with different levels handling everything from our senses to our big picture thinking. Metacognition is what ties it all together.
Hold on. Are you saying that my sense of self, that me feeling, could depend on how well I'm thinking about my own mind? Isn't that a bit out there?
It's a pretty wild idea, and the text even looks at what happens when those systems go haywire, like with schizophrenia.
So if my metacognition breaks down, my sense of self could be shattered.
That's what's so crucial about it. A stable sense of self seems very connected to how well all this is working.
Okay, whoa. So much to think about there. But before we get too lost in existential dread, something else from the text really stood out to me. The parts about resolution and calibration. They seemed really important for, like, day-to-day life.
Absolutely. It all comes down to how accurately we judge our own knowledge and how well we perform.
Okay, so give me an example of that. What does that actually look like?
So, resolution is your ability to judge your knowledge on individual things, while calibration is how well you assess your overall performance.
Okay, so let's say I'm going to ace this quiz because I get all the concepts individually, but then I totally freeze up during the actual test. Is that like bad calibration?
Exactly. You might have great resolution, but that overall self-assessment, the calibration was off. And this isn't limited to academics, it pops up everywhere.
So someone can be way too confident in their business decisions because they've had a few wins, even if they're missing key details.
Exactly. Or a programmer who's sure their code is perfect, but there's this tiny bug that throws everything off. It's about that bigger picture.
Okay, I see how this resolution and calibration thing could be a game changer if you can get it right. But it also makes me wonder, if we can misjudge ourselves so easily, how do we know when to trust our own judgment? How do we avoid those pitfalls?
And that, my friend, is where metacognitive awareness comes into play.
So it's not about like constantly doubting yourself, but about learning how to use your judgment better.
Exactly. We're talking about understanding your strengths and weaknesses when it comes to how you think.
So it's like being aware of the mechanics of your own mind so you can make better decisions.
Precisely. It gets really interesting when you start thinking about it. It's not just about avoiding errors. It's about unlocking this whole other level of self-awareness and control.
Okay, sign me up for that. But before we get ahead of ourselves, there's something we kind of have to address here.
What's that?
Well, we've been talking about how important metacognition is for our sense of self, for agency, but what happens when it goes wrong? I mean, we've all had those moments where our thoughts don't feel totally ours.
Oh, absolutely. And the text goes into this, particularly with conditions like schizophrenia, where your sense of agency gets disrupted.
It's like in those movies where someone is possessed and their body is acting against their will, except you're saying this can happen even without some kind of diagnosis.
Think about those times you're on autopilot, driving home, and you barely remember the trip. Or when a thought just pops into your head seemingly out of nowhere. It all points to just how complex the dance between our conscious and unconscious minds really is.
So you're saying we're not always in control of our own thoughts. That's a bit unsettling, isn't it?
Unsettling, but true. The text grapples with some big questions about free will here, like if a thought just pops into your head, are you responsible for it?
I don't know if I like where this is going. If we start blaming our thoughts on outside factors, doesn't that undermine our sense of responsibility?
Million-dollar question, right? The way I see it, and what I'm getting from the text, is it's not that simple. Remember those mental actions we were discussing earlier? We may not always control the first spark of a thought, but we have a say in how we react to it.
Okay, so even if a thought pops up that I don't like or didn't ask for, I still get to choose how I interact with it.
Think of it this way. You can't control the waves crashing on the shore, but you can learn to surf.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
We might not be the authors of every thought, but we can choose how to ride those waves.
And that's where metacognition is so powerful. The more we understand these processes, the better we become at navigating them, at shaping the course of our own thinking.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. But I'm also wondering about the practical side of all this. How can we actually use this knowledge to improve our lives?
Great question. And this text does offer some answers. For example, once you understand how those fast system 1 and slower system 2 responses work, you start to see your own biases more clearly.
So, like, if I notice myself jumping to a conclusion based on a gut feeling, I can hit pause and actually analyze the situation.
Exactly. Or if you realize your emotions are clouding your judgment, you can take a step back. It's about flexing that metacognitive muscle.
So, in a way, we need to slow down our thinking, be more deliberate.
In a way, yes, but it's not about second-guessing every thought you have. The text also talks about paying attention to what it calls your feelings of fluency.
Okay, feelings of fluency. I think you're going to have to explain that one.
It's that sense of ease or difficulty you experience when you're thinking about something. Sometimes things just click, and other times it's a struggle.
Like when I'm learning a new language, and some words stick right away, but others feel impossible.
Exactly. Those feelings are actually signals from your metacognitive system. They tell us how well we're understanding something.
Wow. So if I pay attention to when things feel easy or difficult, I can actually learn more effectively.
You're getting it. It's like having a built-in feedback loop for your own learning process.
This is blowing my mind. Metacognition isn't just about thinking. It's about understanding the tools our minds use and learning how to use them better.
Now you're getting it.
This has been an incredible deep dive already. We've covered so much about metacognition, from its evolutionary roots to its implications for our sense of self, our decisions, even our thoughts themselves.
It's quite the journey. And we're not done yet.
That's right. We'll take a short break, but when we come back, we're diving into the fascinating world of conversational metacognition, how all these same principles play out when we talk to other people. So before the break, we were starting to see just how much our metacognition shapes not just how we think on our own, but how we understand our own knowledge and abilities. Now we're going even further and getting into the social side of metacognition.
Right. Like, how does all this thinking about thinking play out when we're actually talking to other people? I mean, conversational metacognition sounds kind of like a mouthful.
It does, but it's something we do all the time without realizing it, right?
It is. Think about all those little cues we use to show we're on the same page.
Like nodding along, saying, things like that.
Exactly. Or even a well-timed raised eyebrow when you're not so sure about something. Those are all examples of metacognition in action, just in our social interactions.
So it's like we have this whole secret language we use to signal what we're thinking without coming out and saying it.
Precisely. It's incredible how much information those nonverbal cues can actually convey. And from what this text is saying, those signals are crucial when we're trying to navigate social situations.
Because we want to know if the other person really gets us or if they're just pretending to follow along.
Exactly. And the text even gets into how those signals can be manipulated, let's say.
Oh, interesting. So like someone trying to sound smarter than they are.
Right. Or maybe someone trying to convince you of something by acting super confident, even if they're not. They can use those metacognitive signals in a way that isn't exactly genuine.
Okay, yeah. I can definitely think of times when I've nodded along like I understood something just because I didn't want to look clueless.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
But that's exactly why this metacognitive awareness is so important. The more we understand these processes in ourselves and other people, the better we get at spotting those little manipulations.
It's like a cognitive arms race. The more aware we are of these strategies, the better we can use them, but also the better we get at knowing when someone else is using them on us.
That's a great way to put it. It's like this constant back and forth in every social interaction. And it's really interesting because the text points out how our metacognitive displays can totally change depending on who we're talking to.
Okay, like how so?
Well, you might be more open about your uncertainties with a close friend, right? You don't feel the need to have all the answers. But if you're talking to your boss, or maybe someone you see as an authority figure, you might be a lot more guarded.
It's like we adjust our communication style based on the context, which makes sense.
Exactly. And it highlights just how much metacognition is intertwined with our social interactions. It's not just this thing that happens in isolation.
It makes you realize just how much is going on under the surface in every conversation, right? All those signals flying back and forth.
Absolutely. And it gets even more complex when you factor in things like cultural differences, right?
Oh, right, because what might seem like a polite way to express doubt in one culture could come across totally differently somewhere else.
Exactly. We could totally misinterpret someone's intentions because we're not picking up on those cultural cues. And that's what I find so fascinating about studying metacognition. It not only helps us understand our own minds better, it also shines a light on how complex human communication really is.
It's like we're learning how to read between the lines of our interactions to see the mechanisms at work.
And the more we understand those mechanisms, the better communicators we become, the better listeners we become.
And maybe just better at navigating the social world in general.
Exactly. But we've talked a lot about the strategic side of metacognition, even the manipulative side. But what about its role in building real connection?
Okay, yeah, that's important. Is there a way that all this thinking about thinking can actually help us understand each other better?
I'm glad you asked that because that gets to the heart of what makes metacognition so powerful. It can be used strategically, but its real potential is in helping us connect with each other on a deeper level.
So, right before the break, we were really starting to dig into this idea of a dual system view of metacognition.
And it sounds like it gets pretty complex.
It does. Like, we've got two systems at play, both influencing how we think about thinking. I'm ready to hear more about how this whole dual system thing actually works.
Well, it all starts with these two systems, often called System 1 and System 2, working together or sometimes against each other to shape our metacognitive experiences.
We've touched on them a bit already, but remind me again, what are the key differences between them?
So System 1, that's your rapid-fire intuitive system. It's all about those gut feelings, those instant reactions and associations we make without even realizing it.
Like our brain's autopilot, always running in the background.
Exactly. And it works incredibly well for most day-to-day situations. But then we have System 2, which is much more deliberate. That's the analytical part of our minds that kicks in when we need to solve a complex problem or when we're really trying to be objective about something.
So if System 1 is autopilot, System 2 is like the pilot taking over when you need to make a course correction.
Perfect analogy. But here's the thing, and this is key, metacognition isn't just happening in System 2. Even those quick judgments from System 1 are a form of metacognition, just a more implicit one.
Hold on. You're saying that even when I'm just going with my gut, I'm still engaging in metacognition, even if I'm not consciously thinking about it.
Exactly. System 1 is constantly making these micro-assessments in the background, giving us those feelings of ease or difficulty, which guide our actions. We're always reading those cues, even if we don't realize it.
That's wild.
Yeah.
But so how do these two systems actually work together?
That's where it gets really interesting. Because they're not always on the same page, they interact, they influence each other, and sometimes they even clash.
Like when you have a really strong gut feeling about something, but then you force yourself to analyze it logically, and you realize your initial reaction was totally off.
Exactly. That's the tension between these two systems. And that's why metacognitive awareness is so powerful, because it lets you see those dynamics in action.
It's like having a bird's eye view of your own thought processes.
Precisely. It's about knowing when to trust your gut and when you need to slow down and engage that more analytical part of your mind.
So it's not about ignoring your intuition, but about learning to use it more strategically, more effectively.
Exactly. You've got both these systems. Think of them like tools. System 1 is great for quick, everyday stuff. It's efficient. But System 2, that's for those trickier situations where you need precision, where the stakes are higher. The key is knowing which tool is right for the job.
I like that. It's like having a whole toolbox of cognitive skills. But that actually makes me think of something else. We talk about critical thinking a lot these days. And if we're wired to rely on those System 1 reactions, how do we train ourselves to be more critical, to question our own assumptions? Isn't that a System 2 thing?
That's where things like metacognitive training come in. And the research on this is really promising. It suggests we can actually get better at catching our biases, at challenging our own assumptions.
So it's a skill you can develop, like learning a new language or something.
Absolutely, it takes practice, but you can train your mind to think differently, to question what seems obvious. You have to consciously activate those system 2 processes.
That makes sense, but it also sounds like a lot of work. I'm guessing most of us aren't walking around questioning our every thought.
It definitely takes effort, but it's worth it because the
Mm.
benefits go way beyond just critical thinking. When you develop those metacognitive muscles, you become a better learner, a better decision maker. Some would even say it makes you a more empathetic person.
Okay, wow. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We've gone from exploring the evolutionary roots of metacognition to understanding how it shapes our sense of self, how it plays out in our conversations, and even how these different systems in our brains are working together to make it all happen.
It's a pretty amazing thing when you think about it, and we've really only just scratched the surface of this
It
topic.
really makes you appreciate the power of our own minds, right?
It does. And if there's one thing I hope listeners take away from this conversation, it's that metacognition, this ability to think about thinking it's not just some abstract concept, it's a superpower.
I love that.
We all have this power within us, and the more we understand it, the more we cultivate it, the more we can use it to shape our lives for the better.
It's been an absolute pleasure diving deep into this with you. And for our listeners, keep those metacognitive muscles flexed. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep thinking about thinking.